Something else to consider is the geography of the Mount of Olives. The road leading out of Jerusalem, the road leading out of town, is on the Mount of Olives, right next to the Garden of Gethsemane. If Jesus wanted to escape from Jerusalem and escape the cross, he only had to walk a few minutes more up the Mount of Olives, a short distance, and he could make his escape into the Judean wilderness. He can make an exit here. In the Old Testament, King David fled from Absalom along that same route that Jesus is walking. 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 30, so David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went, as he was fleeing from Absalom. David used the same road Jesus was on to escape Jerusalem. Zedekiah, Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, fled from the Babylonian invaders on this same route in 2 Kings chapter 25. And Zedekiah fled from Jerusalem by way of the Mount of Olives. He made his way out of the city all the way to the plains of Jericho before the Babylonians caught up with him and captured him. My point is, Jesus could have easily escaped Jerusalem and the cross. He had an easy way out. He had an exit. He could just slip out the back, Jack. Just keep on walking up the Mount of Olives, and he could be out of town and out into the wilderness in a matter of minutes. But Jesus didn't take the easy way out. Jesus didn't take the easy way out. He stayed, and he chose to stay. Why? Out of obedience to the Father. Out of obedience to the Father. He came to do the Father's will. And the Father's will was for Jesus to die for the sins of people, to give his life as a ransom for many on the cross, including you and including me. Philippians chapter 2 verse 8 says Jesus was obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Jesus stayed out of obedience to the Father. And he stayed, number two, out of his love for us. He stayed for love. Instead of taking off and running off to avoid the suffering, Jesus stayed for love. Hebrews chapter 12 verse 2 says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Aren't you glad you're not the author and finisher of your faith? Jesus is the author and finisher of our faith. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. And he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame. The joy of reconciling us back to the Father. The joy of spending eternity with us. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame. As we see later in this passage, Jesus didn't want to suffer and die on the cross. He didn't want to go to the cross. He prayed and asked, if this cup could pass from me. He didn't want to go through the pain. He didn't want to suffer, but he stayed and he went through it out of obedience to the Father and because of his love for mankind. And listen, give me your attention, please. Jesus is our example. Jesus is our example to follow. And sometimes we find ourselves in a really, really difficult and painful situation that we just don't want to go through. I just don't want to go through this pain. I don't want to deal with this. And we may be tempted to look for a way out, to look for the exit and take it when it's the Lord's will for us to stay and just go through it and just endure it. And that's God's will. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 10, the Apostle Paul says, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection. And we say, yes, amen. I want to know him and the power of his resurrection. I want resurrection power in my life. But the rest of the verse says, and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. See, sometimes God calls us to the fellowship of his suffering. Sometimes he calls us to be conformed unto his death. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul says of his own life, he's talking about his own situation. He says, we were crushed and overwhelmed beyond our ability to endure. And we thought we would never live through it. In fact, we expected to die. But as a result, we stopped relying on ourselves and learned to rely on God who raises the dead. Paul, again, he says, we were crushed by our circumstances. We were overwhelmed by our situation, beyond our ability to endure, beyond our ability to handle it. We thought we would never live through it. We thought we were going to die. This is going to kill me. I'm never going to make it. I'm never going to live through this. This is going to be the end of me. I don't think I can take this anymore. And he says, but as a result of being in that fellowship of his suffering, as a result, we stopped relying on ourselves and we learned to rely on God who raises the dead. Something has to die to be resurrected. Something has to die to be resurrected. And sometimes we have to experience the fellowship of his suffering to experience the power of his resurrection. And here is Jesus, our example. And Jesus could have easily left town, got out, escaped, but he chose to stay, and he chose to endure it, because that was the Father's will. He didn't want to. He asked if there was a way out, if this cup could pass from me. But he stayed and he endured it.